Hi everyone, welcome to our COMP-CAN Colloquium. We're very happy to have Alex, who just had a baby and we had to postpone, so we're happy that you're here. Hopefully not too tired. So Yves is usually here. He's in Paris, enjoying the sweet French life, I guess. But I think he'll join through Zoom. But yeah, we'll just go ahead and start.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Paris, how terrible. Hi, thanks for coming. I'm Alex. I'm presenting this paper that I wrote with Jean-François Godbout on family dynasties in Canada. It's the title. We went for the Sister Sledge reference. We are family. It's a neat paper. We still have to write it, but everything's kind of ready to go. It'll be done by CPSA. It's also kind of ironic because the Godbout that I'm writing with is a direct descendant of the former premier, Adélard Godbout. And like, I don't want to brag, but my great-grandfather was the mayor of a small parish town in rural Quebec. So we have obviously two dynasties at play here. And generally, when we think of political dynasties, some are kind of apparent and kind of come about rather obviously. Off the top of our head, kind of the most obvious one is probably Camelot, right? It's the Kennedy dynasty, starting with the grandfather. These are at least Kennedys that have been elected. So starting with the grandfather to JFK to RFK to Ted Kennedy, and then we could see their relatives that were elected after them, right? So there's a direct line from RFK, and boy, I guess we'll see what RFK Jr. is going to be doing in a couple of days with the Democratic primary. But we could see, we think of Camelot, we think of the Kennedy dynasty, and yet even this kind of Kennedy dynasty, when we look at it in kind of like the grand scheme of American dynasties or even Canadian dynasties, actually looks particularly quaint. And in the UK, right, another kind of direct lineage dynasty is those elected before and elected after Winston Churchill, right? A clear kind of family path linking Churchill. So we can kind of see that just in framing this thing, dynasties are evidently present. They're a thing, but there's very, very little about whether dynasties exist in Canada, whether they exist at the federal level, at the provincial level, and the extent to whether being part of a dynasty actually offers some type of political or electoral award. So we came across this question, and generally we were like, well, why dynasties? And the two kind of areas that immediately jumped out to look at were in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And as I pointed out before, the Kennedy dynasty is obviously one that pops out right away, right? We can think of the Kennedys and the linkages that exist into today. But we can also think of the Bush family, HWW, Jeb. I think one of them is also like a land surveyor elected position in Texas or something like that. There's the Clinton dynasty to an extent. We think of the Lodge family and the Kennedys, but like I said, although we have two Bushes that were president, a dynasty is hard to say, but particularly when we compare it to a family like the Breckinridge family. The Breckinridge family actually entered Congress in 1789 and left in 1978. So this kind of family dynasty lasted over 72 Congresses and 17 different family members. They changed names, there was like the Lodge family was part of the Breckinridge, but still we have a considerably long dynasty here. And kind of the jumping off point for this paper starts with Dalbeau. Dalbeau and colleagues wrote kind of an economic interpretation of this in the American Economics Review, and they look at dynasties in the US. They find that tenure in office, the longer one is in office, but really what they talk about here is long term. So they define long term as if an individual won at least 2 terms in office at the national level. They found that tenure in office is strongly correlated with the likelihood of having a future family member elected. So the longer you are in office, you build up kind of possibly an institutional prestige, and you pass this on to your descendants, who then themselves can get elected to politics. They actually don't really talk about it from the perspective of institutional prestige. They talk about it as skill. They think that politics might be a hereditary skill that you can pass down to your descendants. Ultimately, they use a regression discontinuity design, which we to an extent replicate, so they can compare the start of dynasties among those who just lost re-election to those who just won re-election. And in doing this, they argue that there is a causal effect between tenure in office and starting a dynasty. So they find a strong and significant effect in the US that time in office is directly causes, they argue, dynasties to follow suit. This was replicated to an extent in the UK by Van Copenhagen, and they replicated Dalbo looking exclusively at the British House of Commons. Van Copenhagen notes that in the 19th century, British politics was largely dominated by a few political families. This was both in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. House of Lords, unsurprisingly, a hereditary body up until like relatively recently. So the presence of families in the House of Lords, not entirely surprising. But in the House of Commons, for Van Copenhagen, argues that that is surprising. But at the UK, in kind of replicating the regression discontinuity design of Dalbo, they find no causal effect between tenure and likelihood of having a descendant elected. So where the American case, it seems clear, the longer you're in office, this is going to cause you to have somebody elected after you. Not so much the case in the United Kingdom, but they do find a political effect. They do find that being part of a family dynasty does make one more likely to be appointed to cabinet. So while there might not be a tenure effect, there seems to be an effect in Parliament itself that might increase the success once an individual is elected to the House of Commons. So enter Canada. Canada is kind of a unique case in this perspective, and it's a really interesting case that can kind of blend what we see in the States and what we see in the House of Commons. Canada is a fairly ideal case. We have, as this kind of like formation of Canada, or what we know as Canada in 1867, we have no landed gentry, right? We don't really have a nobility in Canada, but we do have a Senate. And we know that the Senate is the upper house. It is the kind of the contrast to the House of Commons, where the commoners go, right? The Senate is appointed. It is not hereditary, but it was established with clear British influences at the time of Confederation. So like the United Kingdom, Canada presents itself as a bicameral parliamentary democracy. Unlike the United Kingdom, our upper chamber is non-hereditary, and the House of Lords certainly now isn't hereditary. I think there still might be some hereditary peers, but the Senate in Canada was not hereditary and is not hereditary, as in you don't become a senator just because your father was a senator. Unlike the United Kingdoms, though, Canada has had a long presence of subnational elections. The United States has obviously had state level elections and national level elections, not so much the case in the UK, up until recently with devolution in Scotland and Wales, but provincial elections in Canada, at least in Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Quebec, had been occurring well before federal level elections that occurred after 1867. So we have federalism, we have subnational elections, and there's also an open question of possibly this opportunity of having multiple chambers might allow for regional interest to encourage dynastic links, right? It's not just one arena in which you can have a dynastic link, it's two. Like the USA, Canada's a federal system with subnational elections. Unlike the USA, Canada's a parliamentary system with cabinet mostly selected from the legislature. And there's also this kind of question of Canada as a meritocratic society, right? Dawson's seminal book is that one of the greatest merits of the Canadian political system is derived from the fact that it is a sampling of the best of an average run that can survive the electoral system. An assembly of diverse types of varied experience, the members of which are genuinely and actively concerned with the promotion of national welfare as they see it. But what if that's not the case? What if it isn't the sampling of the best of an average run? what if you get a benefit because you happen to be born to somebody that was elected before, right? Does this change our conception of Canada as meritocratic, as having an open door policy for anybody who wants to enter an electoral arena? And this gets to Porter's point as well. Perhaps it's looking from their politicians that Canadians get the impression that their society is a middle class one. So Porter is arguing that even the House of Commons, there really isn't like a class, right? Or at least Canadians think that they're middle class because we don't have that landed gentry influence that we see in the United Kingdom. But even this notion of there being no political class in Canada, in our mind, is misguided. Okay? Even if we go back to the pre-Confederation era and we look at the rebellions in the 1830s, these were clearly agitations against what people saw as a political class and a political elite. Right away, we know there's the Family Compact in Upper Canada and the Chateauguay in Lower Canada. The Family Compact itself not being a familial relation, these weren't brothers, well, definitely not brothers and sisters, but they certainly weren't brothers and fathers and sons that were serving in the Upper Canada Parliament, but they were individuals that wielded tremendous amounts of power. Their equivalent in Lower Canada was the Chateauguay, and in face of this came the rebellions of 1837 and 1838, the two of which these central organizations were mentioned explicitly in the Durham Report, which lays the foundation for responsible government, and those who have been in my Quebec politics class know this all too well. And even at the Canadian level, right, like the Americans, off the top of our head, we can think of dynasties. There's the Trudeaus. Justin Trudeau, obviously his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Pierre Elliott Trudeau's father-in-law was a cabinet minister, therefore Justin Trudeau's grandfather was elected, right? There's the Laytons. Jack Layton's father was a progressive conservative member of parliament. There's the Martin family. Paul Martin Jr. was the son of Paul Martin Sr. And actually, Jack Layton's got a link to somebody that was elected in Ontario in like the 1820s or something like that, too. So there are linkages that we can think of off the top of our head, but there's even some that are more complex and maybe a little bit more confusing. So this is the kind of family tree of elected members that were related to Honoré Mercier. These are just individuals that were elected to the Quebec National Assembly. So Honoré Mercier becomes premier, kind of the significant figure in French Canadian nationalism. He's the father of Honoré Mercier II, who was elected to the National Assembly. Mercier II is the father of Mercier III, who we have no photo of, making Mercier the grandfather of Mercier III. Mercier is also the father-in-law of Lomer-Gouin, who also becomes a premier. Lomer-Gouin is the father of Paul Gouin, who forms the ALN, making Mercier Paul Gouin's grandfather. Lomer-Gouin is the uncle of Gaspard Fauteur, who has his own linkages underneath, but that makes Mercier the grandfather of Gaspard Fauteur. And just to bring it into the contemporary era, does anybody know who Mercier is the great-great-grandfather of? And Dick Johnston's not allowed to answer this one. Tom Mulcair. Okay, so Tom Mulcair's great-great-grandfather was Honoré Mercier, so it all kind of ties in, right? There's a complicated web here that extends further down because Fauteur himself has descendants that were elected after him as well. So these dynasties are more than just simply father-son. So the Canadian case then, it allows us to leverage the differences between America and the UK in both federal and provincial elections. And that's what we do. At the provincial level, we use a biographical data set of everybody who has ever been elected in the provincial parliaments of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia since the 1790s. This includes their family relations, their occupations, their cabinet appointments. We only have electoral data in terms of votes from 1867 after. We've combined that with the Canadian elections database. At the federal level, we use the Parliament of Canada biography, and we've combined that with Semer-Sevy's electoral data set. So basically, we have the names of everybody who's ever been elected. we have their family relations, their occupations, and whether or not they're in cabinet in these 4 provinces and at the federal level. So why these 4 provinces? We're looking at Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. These are the 4 original provinces of Canada. They already had established legislatures well before Confederation in 1867. The provinces already had some form of party system, even if the identification of these parties was a little tricky. And the provinces were already doing politics, right? When 1867 rolled around, it wasn't like elections weren't new to these provinces. They were already occurring. So party systems, parties, politics in general existed before Confederation, and we had already been starting to see this agitation towards kind of landed interests, towards kind of dynastic links, and towards kind of a lack of like actual democracy that we saw in the 1830s in Upper and Lower Canada. So this is the kind of literature, the kind of findings that we're looking at in terms of the American and the UK case. We can see in the US case that there's a general decrease in the proportion of legislators that have some kind of relation. So it's decreasing over time. Same thing in the UK. So this all checks out. But if we look at panel B in the first figure, that's the proportion of legislators with a previous relative. So it's still about 5 to 10% that have had somebody elected before them. What does this look like in Canada? So this is at the provincial level. These are in the provincial parliaments of Quebec, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and New Brunswick. These are the proportion of these are the proportion of the House that have had somebody elected before. So they all start at 0, so that's good for the most part. Quebec, we can see then peaks at around 50%. So by 1850, at least half of those serving in the Legislative Assembly of Quebec had at least one relative who had been elected before them somewhere down the line. And we can see that this decreases over time. There's a considerable degree of fluctuation over here. And we can see that it is kind of equal now into the contemporary era, but it's still probably around 5 to 10%. So not that dissimilar from what we saw in the United States. Looking at the percentage or the proportion of legislators in these provinces that had somebody elected after them, still kind of a similar pattern. Quebec, right away, when we have our first elections in Quebec, of that first cohort that was elected in Quebec, over 60% of them eventually had somebody elected to office after them. Okay, so Quebec is pretty large here. There's a clear decrease over time. But the takeaway here ultimately is still like the slide before. There are people that were elected with members before them, and clearly there was a benefit or a boost, something happening here with having a member elected after you as well. If we extend this analysis to the federal level, the first panel plots the same thing, but only for members of the House. So these are for members of the House exclusively, and the second one is only for those who are only ever senators. So individuals like Chubby Power, who were both an MP and a senator, aren't included. It's only those who are ever a senator and only ever in the House of Commons. And we can see that the proportion over time since 1867 of those with somebody elected after them, so post-relative, has likewise been decreasing. Pre-relative, however, is actually fairly stable, such that it's about 5%. But it's the Senate that is particularly interesting here, because the Senate was, by definition, a non-hereditary body, right? But it was still an elite body. Look at the pre-relative. As we can see, at one point in the 1940s-ish, about a quarter of those in the Senate had a family member either in the Senate before them or in the House of Commons before them as well. So this idea of the Senate not being hereditary is certainly true, but there's clearly some kind of dynastic relation that's occurring here either way. And at the descriptive level, if we look at those, about 4.7% of those who have ever been in the House of Commons have had somebody elected to the House of Commons before them. It's about 6.3% in the Senate. But in the provinces, it's almost 12%. About 12% of legislators from 1792 have had somebody elected to their provincial legislature before them. That's also 12% of people in provincial legislatures since 1792 have had somebody, a family member, elected after them as well. And if we look at it at the very, very top, if we look at it from the executive level, if we look at all of the premiers under our studies, so premiers being the provincial first ministers, about a quarter of premiers have had a relative elected before them in their respective legislature, and about a little over a quarter of premiers had a member of their family elected after them as well. Smaller numbers of the prime ministers, certainly smaller denominators. There's much less prime ministers than we've had premiers. But 13.5% of prime ministers had somebody elected in their family before them. About a third have had somebody elected after them. This is also just worth keeping in mind. This includes Harper and Justin Trudeau in there as well. They haven't obviously had time to extend their dynasties yet, although it does seem like Stephen Harper's son is going to be angling for that at some point. And this for the prime ministers also only includes House of Commons. So for example, William Lyon Mackenzie King does not count as having a predecessor, even though his grandfather was elected to the Ontario legislature. And we see a huge difference here as well in cabinet, right? Again, about a third of cabinet ministers at the provinces have had somebody in their family elected before and elected after, and about 18%, 19, 20% at the federal level as well. So what we do is we look at just a series of linear probability models in order to look at kind of the effects of dynasties more generally. The first question we ask is just relatively simple, right? Does having a pre-relative have an effect on having a posterior relative? So like, if I had somebody elected before me, does it make me more likely to have somebody elected after me? And we do find, yeah, that is the case. Provincially, if you've had a family member elected before you, you're about 5% more likely to have somebody elected after you. Federally, it's 11%. So these are just linear probability models, and we include a series of specifications. We only include those born before 1950 because we argue that those born after 1950 haven't yet had the time to have their dynasties created. We include province and parliament fixed effects. We remove those who died in office. We include controls for gender, occupation. So these are dummies for whether you had a law, business, or agriculture background, and whether the member was born in the province that they represented. And at the federal level, it's only for those who were ever in the House of Commons. What about vote share? Okay, so basically what we did here is we regressed the vote share that the member got on whether or not they had a pre-relative. Problem here being that we only have biographical data for those who have been elected. We don't have biographical data for those who haven't been elected. So we have a little bit of a counterfactual issue. So what we can do is we can do a little bit of a qualification. At a legislator's first successful election, those with a family member that had previously been elected receive, on average, 1.1% more votes than those without a relation. And this relationship is significant only provincially and not federally. Same controls have been included here, but again, 1.1% at first election. We do need a little bit of qualification here. It doesn't really tell us much, but it does show provincially that at least having a pre-relative does offer some kind of electoral boost. Cabinet is a different story. Being part of a family dynasty offers you a significant advantage once you enter parliament. Provincially, those who had a pre-relative elected to the same chamber had a 6.7% greater likelihood of being appointed to the cabinet. Same thing holds for the federal level, it's just slightly larger. It's 7.2% larger, which on the face of it might seem like a small number, but it's really not, particularly given how small cabinets are and the other kind of regional and religious and socio-demographic things that go into account when selecting cabinet ministers. And there's a considerable federal implication for this, right? There's no electoral benefit at the ballot box, but there is a career benefit once you can get into the House. And this also applies at the Senate. We find that having a pre-relative in either the House or the Senate makes one about 4.3% more likely to be appointed to the Senate as well. Tenure. Okay, so tenure was the crux of the American argument with Talbot, that the longer you serve, this causes you to have descendants that have been elected after you. We find initial confirmatory evidence in favor of Talbot. Those who have served longer in office are more likely to have a relative elected after them, 3.2% provincially, 1.6% more likely federally. But this gets to the question that Talbot and Van Koppenau raise. Longer tenure could just be the result of unobserved family characteristics. It also could be that individuals might lose their first election, lose their second election, and then re-enter. Okay, so how do we account for these individuals? These kinds of electoral dynamics might be at play. So we replicate Van Koppenau's regression discontinuity design. So to get around this, what Talbot does and what Van Koppenau does, Van Koppenau just kind of modifies Talbot, and she, now we can look at those who just lost re-election to those who just won their first re-election. And this is it at this is the regression discontinuity plot. The first panel is for provincial elections. The second panel is for federal elections over 5% window. So we can see the electoral margin having lost from 5 to 0% or having won from 0 to 5%. And we can see that, well, the slopes are different based on provincial and the federal discontinuity plot. But we can certainly see the kind of lack of zero values before losing and the lack of zero values after winning. So yeah, we have the provincial, we have this, but again, it's kind of like nice kind of visual tool. So what we do is when we run the actual regression discontinuity, we also run it through an instrumental variable that Talbot et al. Operationalize. Our regression discontinuity is instrumentalized through a win variable. So that's whether the member won or lost their first re-election. The first stage regresses long-term on win. Long-term is the variable that Talbot uses. This is whether or not you have won at least 2 terms in office. So the first stage regresses long-term on win. The second stage uses the one variable as the instrument for long-term. We include the controls, and we remove those with pre-relatives. We want to look at the start of the dynasty based on this model. And what we can see is that at 2 windows, at 2.5 to 5, 2.5 and 5% windows in provincial and federal elections, in the first stage, the instrument is fairly strong. However, at the second stage, not so much. So the coefficients across both provincial and federal models, across both different specifications of 2.5 or 5% windows, are statistically insignificant. So like Van Koppenau in the UK, we don't find a causal effect, at least on dynasty creation in Canada. We also replicated this based on how Talbot et al. Do it, which is the same instrument. However, they take the predicted values and then regress it on. Either way, everything holds, either using Van Koppenau or replicating Talbot. The second stage, the results are statistically insignificant. So why does this matter? Well, first, honestly, we just kind of think this is neat. The Ontario putting this data together, for those of us who might, which is kind of cool, because like for those of us who might know Eric Merkley, department here, former graduate of this department, in putting this data set together, we actually we found one of his relatives who was elected to the Ontario legislature in like the early 1800s. So we do find clear evidence that family dynasties have been a thing. They've been a presence in Canadian politics, that there are electoral benefits provincially, but not federally. There's career benefits in terms of being appointed to the cabinet. And why the career benefits matter in terms of being selected to the executive is because if we go back to the 1830s and we go back to 1837, 1838, when the Patriots were rebelling against the family compact in the Chateau Clique, they were the executive. right? So it's interesting to see that a couple hundred years later, we're still wrestling with these implications, the impacts of possible family dynasties more generally. So before I wrap up, like I said, I'd like to thank you for hosting me again. And we do obviously have a new co-author to add to this. So he says hello, and thanks for allowing me to reschedule.
Thank you very much. I think we'll just go ahead and start with open the floor to questions. If anybody's online and wants to ask something, just write it in the chat and I can read it out, or I can unmute you.
Can I ask you to, this is more methodological interest, to talk a little bit about your controls? Why are, like, lawyer, business, I think was one of them, agriculture, why are those part of your controls?
They're part of our controls because there's like the kind of like organizational behavior literature also argues that like the sons of lawyers are more like the sons and daughters of lawyers are more likely to become lawyers. So there might be a hereditary aspect of this as well, but also because law and business and in the pre and immediate post-Confederation era, agriculture were the most considerable occupations. So it's just worth kind of controlling to kind of like set that up, but just something we put in there to try and, so nobody can say, well, what about if they're a lawyer? It's like, well, you can control it for that, doesn't really matter.
I assume you don't have data for candidates who were part of families and who never got elected, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So all that possibility, has to be set aside.
Yeah, unfortunately. I really wish we did, but that would be a huge data set. But yeah, no, unfortunately, because like the Quebec National Assembly maintains meticulous records, but only for those who were elected.
I'm kind of interested in the post World War II period, let's say.
Yep.
Because your graph shows it gets very low, right?
At the federal level?
Or, yeah, let's take the federal, it sort of collapses from what it had been for 150 years. And it's interesting because there's some quite interesting comparative studies, and Scully did that 7-country one on dynasties, and the first Smith has done all this stuff in Japan that shows that those systems have much higher levels and have had much higher level all through this period. So something goes on that collapses it in Canada when the same phenomenon is extremely high in Japan and extremely high in Ireland and some other places. I think they put it, their arguments are mostly about electoral systems, right?
Okay.
So I'm curious what you think goes on in the post-war period in Canada that transforms our national politics in a way that doesn't happen in other comparative parliamentary democracies.
That's a great question. I'm going to answer with a very disappointing, I'm not sure. But given that we haven't written the paper yet, these are definitely something that I think we're going to have to try and grapple with. I'm not entirely sure. Looking at it from the House position, I don't know. Do you think possibly, if we just have a conversation, because I don't have an answer, do you think it's possibly like because obviously the electoral system didn't change, at least federally, like a modernization thing, maybe? People are...
well, party mobilization changes.
Sure.
I don't know why it changes so dramatically in Canada, because these are pretty dramatic transformations.
Do you think the franchise has a role to play in this?
Probably not.
No?
In Quebec, it probably does. Quebec franchise law is really complicated, right? When you get those weird periods before Confederation was going to vote, and all kinds of things are going on after that. So, like, I think the electoral election laws in Quebec are really very different. But I don't know. I think that it may be that using the United Kingdom and the US as comparators may not be the most helpful.
Okay.
Looking at systems that do have these kind of dynasties that have perpetuated comparable levels of political development may be more interesting.
So like you mentioned Japan, Ireland.
And a guy named Scully did a PhD thesis at Limerick. I can't remember, I got a copy of it. He has a 7-country comparison. He chooses the countries in terms of 7 different electoral systems.
Okay.
And he does find some striking differences. But his arguments are all about the electoral system. That seems to be trying to explain too much. How you explain, that's a pretty sharp drop, I think, to look at that line. You all know this line starting in 1950.
A little bit after, but yeah.
But it just plunges and then flattens. So something's going on. It's really kind of, I think, there must be an importance. There's an overall decline, but that can be about urbanization, modernization, transportation, all that socioeconomic development stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of that. When we go to in pre-Confederation elections, there's one polling place in most constituencies.
Mm-hmm.
People got 2 days to get to it, 2 days to get home. But after 1950, all that gets sort of like it's not a line, steep decline, and then flatten. I think something's going on there. That's sort of a journey. It's different, I think.
Right.
Because it looks like it could be others. If you have thoughts about that.
No, honestly, the way that we wrote this paper, we didn't really come from it from like that kind of what happened over time thing. It was kind of like just get the models up. But yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good question. Great observation. Did you want to?
Yeah, I'm thinking about if that's possibly contributed by the immigration and diversity policy. And also I think that's the main driving strength of changing Canada's perspective on politics. We are kind of going to that from that time period because of more immigrants and more South suffering to the country.
Before you answer, there's a question on the chat that it's sort of on the same idea on immigration. So it says some of your figures showed declines in the 1940s, 50s. I wonder if you think there might be compositional effects whereby people born outside Canada become a greater part of the candidate pool. Do you imagine some of the dynastic effects might be concentrated among Canadian born?
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Just because I'm just trying to work through my head the kind of logic of immigration in Canada more generally, particularly because we didn't really liberalize our immigration laws until what, the late 60s, early 70s? So I'm not entirely sure if there was enough of a shock during that period. And if there wasn't, and why this shock would affect non-Canadian born MPs or something like that.
So I actually remember I saw some report that's comparing the US South, which is Democratic, the Republican and Democratic, and you can see a more kind of close relationship with kind of dynasties and families in those southern part of US, which is the Republican, which is right-wing politics. So I think immigrants, one of the big things that they did to Canada is it drives Canadian politics to some kind of left wing. That's my general kind of perspective in this immigrants kind of shifting the Canadian politics. So that's why
So isn't a possible shift to left wing, and then as a result, less dynasties.
It's more diversified, so it's harder to find the kind of because family members tend to have a kind of similar political view. So yeah, if it's more diversified, then there will be more chance for others to involve into the politics.
Yeah, possibly. I'm just trying to work through the logic a little bit, because like even if there's a shock to immigrants and like, but is the implication that like those parts of a dynasty, those members are then being replaced by foreign-born members of parliament? Okay. Yeah.
Can you differentiate between like conservative and liberal at any point?
No.
Because that would be interesting for this kind of argument.
I'm not entirely sure. It might be worth looking at, but like we're not entirely sure that there is a difference between liberals and the two major parties, liberals and conservatives, and why it would differ substantively. Provincially, like in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, it's basically only ever been conservatives and liberals that have ever been elected, except for like brief periods. But we're not entirely sure whether party would actually matter or not.
No, it would not for this. It would only matter if this became part of the discussion, right? If
Sure.
there's, like, a
Sure. But then we could talk about brokerage and that kind of yeah.
Yeah, I wonder more about like a cultural explanation with the post-material values changing and values given to family in itself. Like you mentioned Japan, where family is a big thing, where you part of the family, you have a duty to your family. Whereas I wonder if a shift in culture in Canada could affect this sharp decline in the 1950s.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that kind of lines up with the post-materialization thesis. That's cool.
You had a rural-urban division.
We don't look at that, no.
Because Canada is basically rural till Second World War. 50% of the population lives in places that are called urban, but you had to be 1,000 people to be urban. That wasn't a very urban place. Fundamentally rural country. And, that.
You think it just might be picking up on urbanization then?
The rural and urban sides work differently. And certainly the post-war period, I would predict that more of these family characters come from more rural areas, but I don't know. But it's not clear for Japan. Liberal Democrats in Japan are all family business. But in Ireland, there's not a huge group. There's some.
Yeah, the only thing is like we have the name of the constituencies, but we'd have to go back to the electoral map and try to find something. I think that'd be really annoying.
Well, they constantly change.
Yes, that too. Yes, and change, and sometimes they're not marked down right, and so.
I mean, they change the constituencies between elections.
Yes.
Yeah, regular.
Yep.
I wonder
Oh, I'm
if-
sorry.
oh,
Nowhere to go.
thank you, sorry. If there's any studies that indicate whether the people who are voting know about the dynasties.
Yeah,
Or
right.
any like on perceptions and whether that changes. If you know, well, I don't know, maybe if you know the Kennedys, you're more likely to vote for the Kennedys. But if you don't know who the Kennedys are, would you vote for the Kennedys? I don't know, like if that has anything to do as well.
I haven't come anything across that, but that's also something we can't tap into, obviously, because unfortunately we weren't polling in 1792. But it's certainly a possibility, but it could also have like an adverse effect too, right? There are a lot of Quebecers who wouldn't vote for Justin Trudeau because of the last name that's attached to him, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think that's a really good question, and I think that also speaks to some kind of like voter competency too. Like, do you know this person's father was like does it matter to you at all, or does it not too? Yeah. I mean, it might, because like if Dalbo and all are right in their argument that politics might be an inherited skill, then like maybe that should matter to the voters. Like if this girl gained skill from their parent, then wouldn't I want a qualified legislator or something like that? I'm not entirely sure if it is inherited skill or not, because
An indirect measure of that could be just the sheer number of voters in the district.
Fair.
You know, so many of our districts for about 100 years had only a few hundred voters or 1,000 voters compared to districts now with 100,000 voters. Just the sheer ability, you know, in a rural area where there's 1,000 voters, the size of these maritime constituencies, you know, it's half the number.
It's true. It's true. Even looking at those kind of early Quebec election returns, somebody's winning with 98% of the vote, but there's only like 100 votes that have been cast.
I think that's a very good question. That would be a very indirect way to tap into it.
Yeah, definitely.
My question is quite simple, but just I wanted to make sure how you define dynasties. Like, are like sisters, like the David sisters in the Quebec National Assembly, already considered as the dynasties since there's no like leveling, like.
So they're considered dynasties though because their father and grandfather Atanas David was elected before them.
That's right, I forgot about that.
But in the case in Nova Scotia where there were two legislators that entered the same year, they're both elected in like 2007. They got married in 2008. So then we would consider that a dynasty, like not in 2007, but after the election, after when they were elected, after getting married. Yeah.
So it can be like, it can be a relationship. It doesn't have to be, it can be like a, I don't know, like a romantic relationship can be considered as a dynasty.
There is, to be fair, very, very few. But yes, we'd start that after. But honestly, across all 4 provinces in the House, I think there's maybe 4. It's not a lot.
I just wanted to make sure that about the definition, like if it had to be like a father or mother, or if it's like horizontal.
Yeah, so the horizontal is extremely rare. It's mostly vertical. So it's basically just, was this person elected before or after? You get a 1, you get a 0, you get a 1, you get a 0.
Okay, I see. And about the gender, you like talked a little bit about that, but is there like, are there any women dynasties? Or like, I know some women are included, we just talked about the David sisters, but are there, from what you know, from the trends you've seen, are there any like, it's more a specific question. I know it's about the whole research, but is there any women dynasties?
There are some female descendants. I'm sure some have started dynasty, but they're very rare. And this is mostly because we're talking about a period of time, much longer period of time where women weren't allowed to vote than they are allowed to vote, right? Yeah, there are some, but it's mostly men. Because I mean, even now, the women don't make a proportionate share, and if it's going to happen, then we need to give it time, because obviously right now women don't have, legislators now don't really have the time to have these links kind of continue. Right? But no, that's a good question. Almost maybe not worth controlling for, just because we're talking about a huge chunk of time where women couldn't vote and couldn't enter parliament, right? So.
And as I said, I know your research is already quite broad, so I know like it can't really necessarily focus on every.
But even the first woman appointed to the Senate, her father was a senator. So like,
and well, I forgot, but thanks for the comments and congrats for the new.
I have a question about the difference between the US and then Canada.
Okay.
And, I mean, you didn't find the effect of the tenure of the relative in the UK and Canada. I mean, UK is based on the previous study, right? I think one of the big difference between the US and the UK and Canada is the strength of political parties, right? And in the US, I mean, the political parties, they don't control the nominations.
Right.
So the election actually is merit. But in the UK and Canada, political parties, they control nominations and a lot of things. And I think you can explain the difference of the in the US, you see the effect of tenure on the electoral benefits. But in Canada, you don't see that benefit, but you see the benefit in careers, like the cabinet appointment and then the appointment in the Senate. I think that can be explained by the system difference in terms of the political party. In Canada, your parent or your relative have some influence within parties, they are more likely to have influence on your nominations in the district, or the appointment to the Senate, or your appointment to the cabinet post. So I think looking at the relatives' position within political parties actually can be really important in explaining the dynasty effect in Canada and UK.
Okay.
So going back to earlier question about how do you explain that dynamic, maybe looking at what happened within political parties actually can be useful as well. Because something that happened within political parties that might affect the influence of the dynasties over time.
Interesting. So then so in the US then, would we expect the kind of introduction of the primary to have an impact?
I mean, there could be something like that, right? Because the political party leaders had more influence in 19th century.
Right.
Right. So, but then after, and also looking at the voting right, and who has the right to vote,
Right.
actually might matter too. But the party leaders at least lost their control over the nomination at least in 70s. Right? So then individual candidates' reputation matters more, not their connection with the party leaders. So after that, you see the individual reputation, and then you can connect it with the effect of the tenures or something like that. Because I mean, they're all together, right? But here in Canada, the effect of tenure is not necessarily helping your individual reputation. Whether it's kind of building your connection or network within political parties, and then they can help you to be appointed in the Senate or in the cabinet or something. I was thinking about the difference.
Okay. Interesting. That's great. Yeah, sure. Okay. Anyone else?
And I have sort of a follow-up question. Is there any also like trend on how like so if you know that people are voting less, would that be driving that as well? Sort of going back to like a post-materialist idea of like maybe younger generations are not voting as much as they used to.
They definitely, yeah.
Because then your proportion of vote is actually less, right?
So the argument being that like decreased turnout in general
Yeah.
might lead to
this
new
happening.
legislators? I feel like the opposite logic might hold there, no? Like if less people are voting, then that might kind of like re-entrench family dynasties. Possibly. Because then you're not actively looking to elect someone new. There might not be high degrees of legislative turnover. And this is all, I mean, Canada's a system with quite high legislative turnover anyways, but yeah. Turnover is interesting. Turnout is, yeah. That's easy enough, we can look that up. We got
Graphic next to it.
In terms of parties, to follow that comment, you could, when the party labels appear on the ballot, you don't need to know the candidates after 1970s. Before that, you do, because there's no party label on the ballot. And I can't, like in New Brunswick, certainly up until the at least till Richard Hatfield was premier, parties provided the ballots. I mean, but there was no party labels on it. They were just in piles in the polling places. So, you know,
Really?
the ballot labeling process was pretty different. So, I mean, that's
interesting institutional change. You can actually exploit, see the influence of the party labels versus the individual reputation.
Interesting. I actually didn't know that. So what, like the governing part, like, so New Brunswick was also like an MMD system until the 1970s.
yes, and really there really weren't parties there till the 1920s.
Correct.
Really provincially. So certainly up until the 1970s, it'd be about be a 4-member district for the provincial house, right? And each party would produce a ballot paper with the names of their 4 candidates on it. And then there'd be a blank one if you wanted to mix and match. You could write the name yourself. And you had to know which was which, because a liberal would come in and stick a few liberal ballots into the conservative pile and all that. There's 2, 3, and 4-member districts.
Yeah.
They're based on county boundaries. And so you had to know who these people were. And of course, there was a long tradition, particularly in parts of French-speaking Canada, nominating 2 or 3 other candidates with the same name.
Yep.
Well, remember they did it here at Point Grey against John Turner, the federal election when Turner was running for prime minister. They ran an independent called John Turner.
Yep.
Against it.
Yep. 2 René Lévesque ran in 1970.
Sure. So I mean that was an old habit, but it did force people to then find out which was the real René Lévesque and the real John Turner, because there were no party labels on the ballot. So you had to know which was which. So they'd have a name and the occupation. And sometimes their address. That was who told you who the candidates were. And so there was a much stronger incentive to know who about the candidates in earlier periods. And therefore personal reputations in smaller districts with only a few thousand voters.
Right.
I mean, it's a different kind of game.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting.
But by changing those rules, you change that graph. I mean, that's what we're interested in. What's changed, right?
Yeah.
Whether we have it or not is only secondary.
Yeah. Okay. And it's probably not very hard to find, to see, just email some library, National Archives, and see when there are changes to the balloting, right? That actually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, tracing electoral laws.
Yes, I know. I'm doing another thing where I was looking at pensions, and oh my lord.
I mean, so you can compare the provinces, like some provinces a lot did their changes earlier, and other provinces changed that later, so you see the different timing of the changes.
Right.
They can actually confirm that the changes in the parties labeling by party election system actually okay.
Right. Great. Yeah. Thank you. That's really good.
I saw on it was when you were explaining the percentages by, there was something called long term.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
So long term is
That one, yeah.
yeah. So long term is just, that's the main independent variable that Delbo et al. Are interested in to explain tenure. For them, it's just whether or not the member has won at least 2 terms in office. If you've won at least 2 terms in office, you're a long-term member. So like 60% of those in the House won at least 2 terms. 60% of the provinces won at least 2 terms, and then average tenure in both is about, well, it's higher in the House than it is in the provinces, but it's 8.5 to 7.5. I think we could quibble about that, whether winning 2 elections is actually long term or not. I think in the U.S. Senate, probably, right? That's a long time in office, but in the House, probably not so much, right?
1960s.
Yeah.
Much.
Yeah, right. But in the House, probably not so much.
And then sorry, just another question, maybe you.
Don't need to apologize.
Did you consider whether there was a break in those 2 terms? Whether you got elected the first term, didn't get elected, let's say the next one, but then got re-elected with some time in between? Or is this like right away?
So this is like the total. This is for every single legislator, as many rows as elections as they won. But it's not that big of a concern, because like we were mostly interested in what the regression discontinuity design does. It allows us to look at their first re-election attempt. But yeah, no, that's something we could do, but it gets complicated. But yes, it's possible, especially because there are some that like win, lose, lose, win, lose, win.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen that much, though, to be fair, to be sure, but yeah.
So it's just like a tally.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
I was gonna ask, this is going back to the private institution point. If you have an idea of how like insertion parties or whether this is expansion to the United States biographic law, or like really expanding insertion party if they have the same dynastic institutions within them, or if you see differences between like the long-term liberal conservative party and these like
So we haven't looked at it by party yet, because the pre-Confederation provincially can be a little bit tricky, particularly when we're just talking about party people that sit as like reformers or not. And then like we said before, New Brunswick didn't actually, I guess there were like de facto parties, right? Like liberals would kind of sit together, but parties weren't legal until the mid-20s in New Brunswick. So we didn't break it down by party. It's something we could do. I'm not sure. Either way, you're still talking mostly about liberals and conservatives. I'm not sure how much of a difference it would make, but maybe it's just because we haven't done it yet, and maybe there is a difference, right? Like it was kind of mentioned here, maybe you're inclined to see less dynastic relationship in the CCF NDP, right? More egalitarian kind of things at play, whereas the liberals and the conservatives are very much of the old parties, right? So maybe there's more kind of reverence to that, because it certainly seems to be the case that like Arthur Meehan's grandson was appointed to the Senate or something like that, right? So it's exactly.
I feel like maybe it's just me, like since I'm Québécois, but I feel like in Quebec, like the elites and like the political figures, like it's really tight and close, and everybody knows each other, even if they're from COMP-CAN. And so I was wondering if, and I thought about that when seeing like one of the graph where we saw that Quebec had a high average of dynasties. I was wondering, is it like just an impression like that, or is it like actually like is Quebec ecosystem known for being maybe more I don't know, elitist or maybe like smaller? I don't know if you understand what I
No,
mean.
totally, yeah. I know what you mean, because like Québec aussi. It's like when I was putting the kind of data together, it took me forever to do Quebec because of just how like incestuous it is, right? Like why I don't know. Ontario to an extent has the kind of ability to kind of duck out of it a little bit, because Ontario here and here wasn't settled in the same way that Quebec was, right? So when Ontario has their first elections in the 1790s, it's mostly people coming up from the American Revolution. So if you look at the place of birth for those early legislators, it takes Ontario a great deal amount of time to actually have somebody born in Ontario elected to the Ontario legislature. Like that's not a problem in Quebec because France was there, right? Like we're here, we exist. So like, yeah, maybe there's also maybe that like seigneurial thing at play too as well. But yeah.
I must say, just even before your lecture, I had in mind like when just reading Dynasties, I thought it was my friend, but I just thought about like Jean Rivard, where basically like a lot of dynasties are focused on or concentrated, and so I didn't have any question related to that, but I really thought like it's really Quebec. Is it unique in this way, or is there a Quebec in Ontario and Nova Scotia?
Right, it's true. Yeah, I don't know, but even Quebec, like I was both surprised and not surprised at all. Right? Like, anyone else? Well, did you have one? Or you look like you're twitching to.
It might be outside of the scope of your research, so I apologize in advance. I'd be interested if you have an idea on local politics and how that can reflect dynasties. So like when we look at literature on how you're developing development plans to like this nationalistic approach of being able to get goods to a certain population, I just wonder if that's something to do with dynasties in Canada, especially for seeing developing from local states.
I don't know. Locally though, like I mean, we talked about the Laytons, right? Jack Layton started municipally. His son is elected. If the polls are right, his widow should be elected mayor of Toronto. Looks like Olivia Chow might win that. goes to the US case, right? The Dailies held a pretty significant iron fist over Chicago for some time too. I don't know, but it seems possible. And again, maybe, like it was mentioned here about name recognition, maybe it matters even more locally when turnout is super low, and you might use that as a heuristic, right? Like, oh, I remember the dad. I have no idea who these. I went to go vote in the Vancouver municipal election, and I unrolled my scroll to figure out who to vote for, right? And it's like, if there weren't party labels on there, I'd be completely lost. Yeah. If not, we can wrap it.
Yeah. No questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is a good chat. Thanks a lot. This helps tremendously for people.